You can configure a running Linux or an AIX system as a network installation resource, using which you can install a new Linux virtual machine. Let's check out a few of the network protocols which can help us with that. If you're using the PowerVM hypervisor, we may use BOOTP, TFTP, DHCP, and HTTP. BOOTP is an IP protocol that informs a computer of its IP address and where on the network to obtain a boot image. Trivial File Transfer Protocol, or TFTP, that's used to serve the boot image to the client. Finally, DHCP is an IP protocol that distributes network configuration parameters. We might also use HTTP or HTTPS or FTP to move other configuration data. In this diagram, we see that DHCP is used to allocate the IP address of the target node which should boot for the first time. In the DHCP server, we'll also configure the location of the TFTP server. Once the IP address is allocated, the node can now request the grub2 binary, configuration, kernel, and init.rd, or the initial RAM disk, from the TFTP server. Grub is the bootloader, or the first software which is responsible for loading the kernel. Finally, other installation-related files can be delivered to the target from a file or a web server. Easily put, the bootloader will pass control to the kernel, hand it to the init.rd, the initial RAM disk, let the kernel mount it, and get what it needs. Later, the kernel can delete the init.rd and replace it with the real root file system. And don't worry if you don't understand all of this process right away. If you're running PowerVM on bare metal power servers, you may use something called a petite boot bootloader, DHCP, and other protocols as well, like HTTP, HTTPS, and FTP. The Linux server can be configured as an installation resource which acts as a server of all of these protocols. Now that we've seen the basics of netbooting a Linux operating system, let's take a look at all the configurations that need to be in place for all the protocols to work. Typically, in IBM Power environments, administrators have relied on using an AIX-based NIM, or Network Installation Management server, to install NIM clients. Needless to say, the server provides the files and programs needed to manage a client. In this NIM server, we could have a /etc/bootptab file, which is the configuration database file for DHCPD, or the DHCP daemon, which provides the implementation of BOOTP and DHCP server. Remember how we talked about needing the BOOTP protocol to do network installations? Well, in this file, we'll edit all BOOTP related stuff. Then we edit the configuration file for DHCP. That's the file in /etc/dhcpd.conv. Here we'll add information regarding the client node you'd like to install, such as its hostname, IP address, and so on. Now, grub, that stands for Grand Unified Bootloader. Grub version 2 is the current standard in the Linux space. During the boot process, the file /etc/grub2.cfg is read to define the basics of the boot process. With the installation, this file is presented by the installation media, so you don't need to edit this file. When you power on a computer, the BIOS, or the basic input-output system, that's the first thing that runs. And the purpose of the BIOS is to verify hardware integrity and then to hand over the boot process to the bootloader. Grub2 is the most commonly used bootloader. To provide an overview, the bootloader is responsible for loading the operating system on the system disk. It does this using init.rd, which we talked about before. When a system boots up, you can see a lot of log messages that will help you understand the boot process better. You can see these log messages under the /var/log/dmesg file if you're interested. Now, IBM Power servers that are running the Power hypervisor include a layer of open firmware, OF. This layer is difficult to navigate, so IBM added a layer of code named the System Management Services, or SMS, to assist with operations at this level. This is some of the easiest to use boot software I've seen. There are only 5 options in the main menu. Option 2 is typically used to set up network installation, while option 5 is used to see more boot options, including picking a boot device. When you select the Setup Remote IPL option, you can enable and set up the remote startup capability of your server or logical partitions. Remote Initial Program Load, or IPL, is an IBM term that refers to the boot process. A list of network interface card NIC adapters in the server is displayed. Then you are prompted to select the boot protocol, for example, along with other options which assist with remote booting this partition. Pressing 5 from the main menu will take you to this screen. This is the Boot Options menu. This is used to select a variety of boot paths. For example, you want to boot from a CD or a DVD, then select option 3, and so on. Option 7 lists all the available devices and may be very helpful to see if a mounted device is actually available to boot from.